Hello, this is late night live stream number 1. It's part of the podcast called Blood and Rain. I'm your host, Arthur Dane. As I get accustomed to being a YouTube creator and the different set of norms and different set of standards, I found that YouTube live streaming is friendlier towards what could be described as unstructured thoughts. Some might even call it winging it. And a new muse for me in this year of my life has been the city of Chicago. Chicago is the place I moved to from my home in the San Francisco Bay Area. For those of you who are very devoted followers of my work, you'll know I was in Austin for 10 days before having settled in Chicago. There are many places that I've been to that I can say I understand. I can describe the dynamics of San Francisco, Oakland, London, New York, Birmingham, United Kingdom, and to an extent, Edinburgh and Seattle. However, when I came to Chicago, I noticed something in what can be called, and what Trent Reznor has called, the background world. It's the world behind the world that we can see. It's where the spirit of things lives. And of course, God, angels, and demons. Chicago is confusing. To be in the middle of it is to know a place that has a series of neighborhoods with zero continuity. And this can be somewhat unnerving for a lot of people. To me, it's it's fascinating. It's alluring. And in all honesty, I don't think it's something that can be understood during the day, only in the middle of the night. In May of last year, my girlfriend Victoria took me through a trip throughout the city. And for those of you who can hear the boxing bell in the background, I am in a gym somewhere in the heart of this city. But Victoria took me to Grant Park. Parts of it felt like Paris. Parts of it felt like it was striving to be that ornate garden haven. As I stood at the fountain, central to it, staring at the Congress Hotel and other old Chicago buildings, dead ahead, it was reminiscent not only in aesthetic but in essence of Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco, just larger. And as I turned to my right, to face the north, I saw the edge of glass skyscrapers touching the ends of Grant Park, reminiscent of Central Park West in New York City. And then I turned to the east, directly behind me, and there's a Clearwater Lake. It brings far more melancholy and peace than anything with an ocean side. An ocean is what it is. It's straightforward. A lake, especially one that large, makes you think, what the hell is this city doing here? Some famed streamers of Chicago, some famed content creators, have called this place an evil place. While I'm not entirely sure that's true, one thing I can make as a claim about Chicago is I believe that it was built against its will. The city didn't really want to be here, but for the sake of human commerce, its locale demanded it. Great Lakes are a third coast. Many have called the Gulf the third coast, but in reality, it was the Great Lakes that are utilized greater. And you have what is the typical afflictions of a second city. Similar grandeur, just on a smaller scale to New York City. And it's a stopping point before the Great Frontier. And for those of you who know their history and geography, it was the very edge. It was the West, but really it was in the middle of the continent, therefore being called the Midwest. It was the frontier, this vast expanse of land that once didn't belong to the United States, at one point belonged to Spain. And then shortly after France and Louisiana Purchase, this nation doubled in size. And beyond that, not too long later, about 44 years, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave us the fabled Pacific coast. So it is clear why a city like San Francisco and later on Los Angeles was needed. It's the gateway to the East, to Asia, to the Japan that was in isolation. But then we have Chicago. Flat. Very few hills in sight. And on the doorstep of the Great Plains. Still, you look around, you go from neighborhood to neighborhood, Westtown, Ukrainian Village, Streeterville, Gold Coast, Wrigleyville, Wicker Park, and you see a series of neighborhoods that carry their own essence without a true common thread. Maybe not always at war with itself, but not completely united. And in the middle of the night, when I was dipping into old habits for the sake of secondary income, I found myself in River North and Streeterville and Gold Coast. These are neighborhoods that are central to Chicago, right on the rivers, tall stone towers of neoclassical style, and in some cases, Art Deco. And one has to wonder, what if America's future continued to look like that? This nation is spectacularly Anglo in many ways. This nation is an extension of the Anglo ideal. And if you go to a place like London, or in even some cases Manchester, even some cases Newcastle, and the two grand cities of Scotland and Glasgow and Edinburgh, you will find this Gothic style of architecture. Wonderful grandeur, a wide city. But not tall. And here you have this nation founded by Anglo-Saxons, carried on by Anglo-Saxons for a little over 100 years before being replaced by a new Ellis Island stock. You had a nation that took the neoclassical and Gothic ideal and put it on stilts, truly scraped the sky. In New York City, what I've recently seen in Chicago. The movie The Batman captured this quite well. When those comics came out in the late 20s, I believe 1927, it's modeled on Gotham, New York City, but in some instances, Chicago. It is capturing a future that was promised but never delivered. You see pictures from the 1880s, the 1890s, all the way through the aughts, and the introduction of America to Europe, its post-Civil War state, and its industrialized state. You'll see pictures of these gorgeous stone towers striving, the American banner atop it, looking like something new, despite its bedrock, despite its roots. A European aesthetic ideal, a truly hierarchical society, but wide open, able to have a man climb to the very top if he so wills it and is clever enough. But perhaps this is the problem. There is a spirit of this nation that can be found dormant in these buildings in New York City and right here in Chicago. Some could liken it to the Tower of Babel. And perhaps those parallels are undeniable. But there is something more innocent. But at the same time, there could be a spirit that could be described as Nietzschean. And I found myself wandering through this city and its most beautiful parts by the river. And I tried to see through it, tried to see viscerally, not just with my eyes. Try to see to that background world to see its true spirit. For those of you who are familiar with this time in history, you really had three nations coming into focus rather, rising to prominence. You had Germany, who was a recently christened nation, born in the victory of the Franco-Prussian War and the cunning of Otto von Bismarck. A nation that united a people who should have been united a long time ago. Germany was the writing on the wall. It was the future of Europe. You had a Victorian era in the United Kingdom, the Empire of Great Britain, the British Empire. And in some ways was peaking. In some ways showed a noticeable decadence. And you had the United States and its Gilded Age. Now, think of the spirit. Think of the spirit of this era. You can see the early signs of someone itching for a fight. You can see the early signs of Germany and the United Kingdom you can see this coming to a head where you can see the rise of Germany threatening the supremacy of the British. What you can really see is this notion on both sides of the Atlantic that God was no longer needed, that maybe we could take it from here. It's an increasingly Protestant era, an era that had a decreasing rate of liturgical worship. This is the era of nihilism. This is the era of German Romanticism. Once again, the era of Nietzsche. And perhaps Nietzsche is the central figure in a movement that is far grander than just himself. Schopenhauer and Goethe and Wagner, and in some cases Zoroaster. Now, to read Nietzsche and his concepts of the Übermensch and the intro to his text Beyond Good and Evil is to see a man descending into madness, searching for a divinity in Europe itself that isn't there. He's fallen into the mistake of confusing a spirit of a people, a spirit of a continent, as something that is truly original, a bedrock. It's rather comical to read, especially if you read it aloud. You see a man who is cutting down everyone, a man who was scorned for his previous text, and is lashing out. He talks about the sensualists being plebeian. He talks about those of a Platonic worldview being, quite frankly, just idiots. The Stoics, a kind of people who shove Europe in a cage, yet he's insisting that there's something natural that must be felt, that can't be thought, but also has to be thought. It's a struggle to remove oneself from God. And he wasn't the only man who was onto this sort of thing. Listeners, you know where I stand as an Orthodox Christian. You know where I stand in relation to Catholicism, and an offshoot of Catholicism is Protestantism. And while I'm not here to bash on a strain of Christianity, we had a Protestant movement come out of Germany, give way for a decadent king to start a church of his own. For radical John Locke agreeers. Also, various Protestant strains like Puritanism to come to this nation for the sake of religious freedom. The Baptists came from that, and the Southern Baptists. We had a nation in the United States that was coming off a new kind of God emerging in industry and innovation. The agrarian had been defeated, and cities and railroads and touching the sky and creating a future from nothing. There's a part of me that sees these beautiful structures like Tribune Tower in Chicago and the Chrysler Building later on in New York City and think, where did we go wrong? What happened to this? Why didn't this keep going? But really, it's just an early sign of decay. It's just an earlier sign that is beautiful. It is a dying star, a gorgeous death, the spirit of a nation. What came after? Further confirmation in our way being correct and victory on the world stage. While Asia was destroyed, Europe destroyed, and American innovation industry economy thriving. Good morning and war to you too, Harville Wallmaker. And it's reminiscent of something almost Luciferian. It's deeply sad to me because it's a beauty that can never really continue. And it's a beauty that I wish had God at its center. Now, in the case of Germany in relation to the United States and Britain at this time, there are multiple content creators who I won't name who discussed the German Empire as being the last chance to escape the clutches of an international elusive class that control the world, to get out from under them and be a society with a Hellenic ideal. It was a society of strength and merit and chivalry and honor. One needs only to look at what it takes to be an officer in the Prussian army. It doesn't take a degree. It takes an application, or it took rather. It took an application and a year of serving at the bottom of a particular unit, whichever unit was applied to, and a series of tests and approval from every member of that unit. It is truly earned from top to bottom, bottom to top. If Germany won World War I, or perhaps if there was a peace of 1916, if the United Kingdom did not sell itself, destroy itself to destroy Germany, we'd be living in a different world. And perhaps Christ could still be at the center of it. And that gave me this question. That gave me the question, whether or not this kind of thing could be resurrected. As I was searching for my car in downtown Chicago, I couldn't find it. I stopped right by the river, close to these old stone towers. And I began to write, I began to bleed as best as I could. And I started to ask this question in writing. I wrote as follows: on December 30th, 2022, I don't quite understand the balance just yet, but it is certainly establishing itself within the corners of my psyche. The balance between the entire separation from the world in order to serve God with every ounce of my being, to then interact with the world that is by no means Gnostic or Platonic, but truly Christian and conquering the world both spiritual and material. In what instance are you trying to show me, God? I know the bare bones way, but you told me that it would wither if I stayed in San Francisco. Now I find a city with far more grandiose energy to press against, but it is not this energy that I want to worship. Can a Hellenistic society be structured around you, my Lord? Are the Western lines less treacherous than I initially imagined, or more treacherous than I could have ever possibly fathomed? Are these old stone towers of American glory those of Babel? Are they an attempt to grow closer to you, my Lord, and with full hearts? Or are they awaited to be inhabited by you, my Lord? I pray to you now to understand fully what our place is here. There are too many moments I am in absolute awe only to remind myself that the West is not divine in itself. Still, these structures inspire upward, and only you are most high. I just couldn't leave it alone. I want it to be real. And maybe this is the kind of thing that doesn't start as godly, but maybe at the center of it, its core can change. It can be Christianized, the spirit. Maybe, just maybe. Because the warnings of what happens when it is not Christianized and it's worshipped in and of itself, then, well, you have what happened to America. This beautiful thing, this promise of an endless, boundless dream. The American dream is something that has morphed into anti-culture now. We wondered what happened But in reality, we haven't. The deception of this kind of beauty, so outward, with no core of God, will lead you down this fantastical abyss that promises to be endless, but really it's as shallow as the kiddie pool. The water's just going to your ankles, but you're putting your face in it, staring into what you think is endless, and it's just not there. And this kind of deception is intoxicating. I've never done a drug in my life, but I can imagine it's probably what heroin feels like. You get that sense in the dawn of modernism. It all comes to a headway after World War I. We weren't sure if we were going to live or die in this new mechanized warfare where empires came to an end. So now what? If anything's possible, perhaps the American dream is the final destination. Perhaps all this material, all this decadence, if we keep pressing forward into it, then maybe we'll reach this eternal ecstasy. Ernest Hemingway is a writer who's from this great city of Chicago. But if there's a writer who, in truth, captures it best, it is really the father of chronicling the rise and fall of the promise of a godless America, the false god. It is none other than F. Scott Fitzgerald. Many of you were forced to read The Great Gatsby in high school, and maybe you read it, maybe you didn't. In some ways, it's the most important text in the American canon. And in other ways, it's an incredibly vapid story. But the text just drips off the page and harkens back to an era that thought of a founding stock that thought it was evolving, but in reality, but was beginning to die a slow and beautiful death. But Gatsby wasn't the text that marked this change. It wasn't the beginning of modernism. It was in a text that was 5 years earlier, not 1925, but 1920, in a text called This Side of Paradise. And it's been some time since I've read anything Fitzgerald. I've read a lot of his work, but one work that has eluded me is a text called The Beautiful and Damned. And this is something that my girlfriend brought home from the library and said she's going to read, but she soon became more enamored with the work of Willa Cather. And she asked me if I was going to read it before she had to bring it back to the library, and I said yes. And let's get the commentary about America's literacy out of the way. The text in this book is so poetic and beautiful and fluttery and in and out of flourishing, shining statements of both material and immaterial. Perfectly captures what we think is going skyward forever in the American spirit, but finds itself taking a great fall. as do all of Fitzgerald's works. In chapter 1 of The Beautiful and Damned, we meet its main character. The chapter is named after its character, Anthony Patch. And getting aside this text, 100 years ago now, 101, this book was released on March 4th in its entirety, March 4th, 1922. And this description of the psyche of this man as a kind of text that really shows where the mind of the American ruling class and founding class was. Striving for something greater, something more noble but still new, not being locked in the rigid hierarchies could really be considered not only hierarchies but locked castes of the old world. It's text that most people, unfortunately, in this time couldn't really appreciate, really couldn't understand, let alone appreciate or love. But in reality, the clues, the plight of the American spirit in this turn in Europe, the fall of the European spirit and rejection of God, it's all here. And starting in its 4th page, this section of the chapter, A Worthy Man and His Gifted Son. It reads as follows. Anthony drew as much consciousness of social security from being the grandson of Adam J. Patch as he would have from tracing his line over the sea to the Crusaders. This is inevitable. Virginians and Bostonians, to the contrary, notwithstanding, an aristocracy founded sheerly on money postulates wealth in the particular. Now, Adam J. Patch, more familiarly known as Cross Patch, left his father's farm in Tarrytown early in '61 to join a New York cavalry regiment. He came home from the war a major, charged into Wall Street, and amid much fuss, fume, applause, and ill will, he gathered to himself some $75 million. This occupied his energies until he was 57 years old. It was then that he determined, after a severe attack of sclerosis, to consecrate the remainder of his life to the moral regeneration of the world. He became a reformer among reformers, emulating the magnificent efforts of Anthony Comstock, after whom his grandson was named. He leveled a varied assortment of uppercuts and body blows to liquor, literature, vice, art, patent medicines, and Sunday theaters. His mind, under the influence of that insidious mildew which eventually forms on all but the few, gave itself up furiously to every indignation of the age. From an armchair in the office of his Tarrytown estate, he directed against the enormous hypothetical enemy, unrighteousness, a campaign which went on through 15 years, during which he displayed himself a rabid monomaniac, an unqualified nuisance, and an intolerable bore. The year in which this story opens found him wearying his campaign had grown desultory. 1861 was creeping up slowly on 1895. His thoughts ran a great deal on the Civil War, somewhat on his dead wife and son, almost infinitesimally on his grandson Anthony. Early in his career, Adam Patch had married an anemic lady of 30, Alicia Withers, who brought him $100,000 and an impeccable entree to the banking circles of New York. Immediately and rather spunkily, she had borne him a son, and as if completely devitalized by the magnificence of this performance, she had thenceforth effaced herself within the shadowy dimensions of the nursery. The boy Adam Ulysses Patch became an inveterate joiner of clubs, connoisseur of good form, and driver of tandems, At the astonishing age of 26, he began his memoirs under the title New York Society as I Have Seen It. On the rumor of its conception, this work was eagerly bid for among publishers, but as it proved after his death to be moderately verbose and overpoweringly dull, it never obtained even a private printing. This Fifth Avenue Chesterfield married at 22. His wife was Henrietta Lebrun, the Boston Society contralto, and a single child of the union was, at the request of his grandfather, christened Anthony Comstock Patch. When he went to Harvard, the Comstock dropped out of his name to a nether hell of oblivion and was never heard of thereafter. Young Anthony had one picture of his father and mother together. So often had it faced his eyes in childhood that it had acquired the impersonality of furniture, but everyone who came into his bedroom regarded it with interest. It showed a dandy of the 90s, spare and handsome, standing beside a tall, dark lady with a muff and the suggestion of a bustle. Between them was a little boy with long brown curls dressed in a velvet Lord Fauntleroy suit. This is Anthony at 5, the year of his mother's death. In 1913, when Anthony Patch was 25, 2 years were already gone since irony, the holy ghost of this later day, had theoretically at least descended upon him. Irony was the final polish of the shoe, the ultimate dab of the clothes brush, a sort of intellectual there. Yet at the brink of this story, he has as yet gone no further than the conscious stage. As you first see him, he wonders frequently whether he is not without honor and slightly mad. A shameful and obscene thinness glistening on the surface of the world like oil on a clean pond. These occasions being varied, of course, with those in which he thinks himself rather an exceptional young man, thoroughly sophisticated, well adjusted to his environment, and somewhat more significant than anyone else he knows. This was his healthy state, and it made him cheerful, pleasant, and very attractive to intelligent men and to all women. In this state, he considered that he would one day accomplish some quiet, subtle thing that the elect would deem worthy, and passing on would join the dimmer stars in a nebulous, interdeterminate heaven halfway between death and immortality. Until the time came for this effort, he would be Anthony Patch, not a portrait of a man, but a distinct and dynamic personality, opinionated, contemptuous, functioning from within outward, a man who was aware that there could be no honor and yet had honor, who knew the sophistry of courage and yet was brave. The line captures everything I've been rambling about these entire 42 minutes. In this state, he considered that he would one day accomplish some quiet, subtle thing that the elect would deem worthy, and passing on, he would join the dimmer stars in a nebulous, interdeterminate heaven halfway between death and immortality. Now think of America today. Think what it means to be a celebrity. Think what it means to be the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi, more appropriately, in light of the World Cup recently 3 years ago. It's to seemingly be immortal, as he wrote, to be greater than everyone else, to be in a space between death and life, not needing to interact with the day-to-day, not needing to deal with the mundane, or in some instances to deal with the mundane in grandiose and surreal ways. It is an outrageous arrogance. It is horrible, because you know how it ends. And it ends that way in all of Fitzgerald's texts. Hate to spoil things. Between Gatsby, The Side of Paradise, and while I haven't gotten to the end yet, I'm sure it's the same with The Beautiful and Damned. His muse, his wife, Zelda Fitzgerald, originally of Alabama, an old southern waspy socialite, really wasps, as he stated in the text I just read, really lie between the old guard of Boston and Virginia. I love the work of Fitzgerald. I love the architecture of Chicago. I love the Gilded Age, the Victorian era, the rise of Germany. In some ways, a peak of literature, a peak of society, a peak of honor, aesthetics. But it all collapses without God. What is promised that does not match the material, that does not match a bedrock in the mind that can only be sustained in prayer, it all falls apart. It's the early sign of progress, the false god. And it is more alluring than you could possibly imagine, as Satan is the great illusionist, the angel of light. Thank you for all of you who tuned in. Didn't expect to be doing this tonight. It's very impromptu. I have a piece that's going to continue to build on these kinds of things, original writing. It'll be released on Substack. It'll be separate from anything else I'm working on. It's not Sleepless, despite it being 3:07 here in Chicago. And it's really something I needed to get off my chest and need to continue to get off my chest, because there's something there and I need to put it all to paper. I've felt this spirit of this Nietzschean spirit, this Faustian spirit, that's so grand but leads straight to hell. And perhaps I'll do this again next week. And once that writing is finished, I can talk about the spirit that same spirit I've felt here and felt in New York City. Later today will be the podcast of Prismatic Orthodox that's been long awaited. It's part of the Lenten series. Lent for me has not gone as I wished, but in a lot of ways I'm shedding something that is needed to be shed. As a preview of what's to come in the next late night stream, as I continue to hash out these thoughts. Next time I'll need an all-nighter. I'll leave you with a preview of what's to come and something I've recently written, many of you have liked on Instagram, and then I'll sign off. Bad memory. I sat in a bar in Brooklyn, a cursed and wretched place, sinking into a glass of rye, darkness shrouding my eyes. I wore a half smile, a bleak kind of a grimace, too stubborn to die, too clouded to live. Embracing the belly of the behemoth, a haunt following me every place I went. Look at that man sitting in the corner. Look at that man sitting alone at the bar. Black boots, black denim jacket, black hoodie. What is it you're writing? I had to come and speak to you. What made these people think I wanted to take part? What made these people think I wanted to opt into humanity? What made these people think I didn't want to disappear into the crowd sitting in plain sight? I can be whatever you want me to be, just don't ask me to actually speak. I see something within this fray that everyone seems to desire outmaneuvering. No, I want to stand still. There's a thread somewhere in here I want to pull on. Now, I don't have to exist. Good night. Good storms. God bless. Thank you.